Tan Kim sat in the heavy silence, her mind drifting back to the first time their paths had crossed. It was during a recruitment session at her former advertising agency. She had been the one in the hiring seat, the gatekeeper of futures. Candidate after candidate had filed into the room, a blur of mediocre faces and uninspired portfolios that left no trace in her memory. But then, Lam Ky walked in, and the atmosphere in the room shifted instantly, leaving a deep, indelible impression. Lam Ky didn't wait for an invitation, she simply placed her portfolio on the desk with a sharp, rhythmic thud and spoke with a chilling confidence. "I have no formal degrees to show you, but I possess something far more valuable. I have talent." As time went on, she proved those words with a ruthless efficiency. Whether it was a high-stakes campaign or a niche market, Lam Ky excelled, her mind a blade that cut through every obstacle. She possessed a terrifying ability to manipulate and persuade even the most stubborn clients. There were many moments when Tan Kim felt a shiver of unease at Lam Ky's methods. She was a woman who would stop at nothing, disregarding ethics, and stepping over anyone to achieve her goals. Yet, for a woman standing alone and vulnerable in the cold, predatory heart of this city, Tan Kim knew that to keep one's head above the drowning crowd, there was often no other choice but to embrace the darkness. Later, when Tan Kim resigned from the firm, it was Lam Ky who stepped into the void she left behind, claiming her position like a predator claiming territory. As the old saying goes, only after a bloody fight do people truly recognize their kin, and so, through their professional rivalry and mutual ambition, they forged a bond that became a deep, albeit complicated, friendship. The four of them had lived in a fragile bubble of happiness and peace, or so it had seemed. Then, with the suddenness of a lightning strike, the world shattered. Lam Ky was dead, gone in a way that defied easy explanation. Ky began to unravel, his mind fracturing under a weight of unseen horrors. Everything spiraled into a chaotic nightmare. In a single, agonizing heartbeat, they had plummeted from the heights of paradise into the suffocating depths of hell. Tan Kim's mind spun in a frantic loop, trying to pinpoint the exact moment their lives had been cursed. Where was the root of all this calamity? What ancient, sleeping evil had they accidentally awakened? Exhausted and hollowed out by grief, Tan Kim could do nothing more than bury her face into the cold upholstery of the car's back seat, desperate to shut out the world. She wanted to drown her thoughts in the darkness, but her weary, broken posture could not escape the watchful eyes of Luke two men. He watched her through the rearview mirror, his gaze lingering on the curve of her trembling shoulders. Never in his life had he felt such a visceral, stabbing empathy for another person's agony. Every tiny movement she made, every shallow breath she drew, seemed to ripple through his own body, tethering his soul to hers. He wondered with a sense of quiet dread if this was the legendary love at first sight so often romanticized in novels, a lightning strike that illuminates the world even as it threatens to burn it to the ground. Before long, the car pulled up to the front of her house. He walked her to the door, his movements lingering, reluctant to let her go back into the shadows of her home. He had initially intended to invite her to share a meal, to keep the ghosts at bay for a few more hours, but he feared his approach would be too abrupt, too intrusive given the fresh trauma. Moreover, the case of Lam Ky's death was riddled with shadows and unexplained anomalies. He felt a driving need to return to the office and dig through the files, searching for the truth hidden beneath the layers of official reports. She watched the taillights of his car vanish into the night, feeling a fleeting, fragile warmth bloom in her chest. The moment she stepped inside her home and pushed the door open, a dark, fluid shadow flickered past her vision. Something small and black darted through the air, disappearing instantly into her leather handbag. When she looked closer, she realized it was Hak Bao, her cat. The creature was transformed, every hair on its body stood stiffly on end like obsidian needles, its back arched in a primal pose of terror and aggression. It hissed at the expensive leather bag as if the lifeless object had suddenly sprouted fangs, its eyes wide and wild as it prepared to do battle with the greatest enemy of its life. Tan Kim spent a long time whispering soothing words to Hak Bao, stroking its trembling frame until the tension began to drain from its body. She poured out a bowl of food for the cat and, with a sudden feeling of revulsion, tossed the leather bag into a dark corner of the room. Only then did Hackbow seem to regain its composure. The first gray light of dawn was beginning to bleed through the curtains. She had spent the entire night awake, haunted by the events at the station. Exhaustion finally claimed her, and she collapsed onto her bed, falling into a deep, dreamless sleep that felt more like a loss of consciousness than rest. When she finally clawed her way back to wakefulness, the world outside was bathed in the bruised purples and oranges of twilight. Though her heart was still heavy with a crushing melancholy, the reality of going over 24 hours without food or water had left her body weak and trembling with hunger. She forced herself up, opened the door, and decided to cross the street to a small eatery to fill the void in her stomach. As she prepared to leave, Hackbow suddenly leaped onto her, its claws catching in her clothes as it let out a series of frantic, pleading cries. It was as if the cat was begging, desperate not to be left alone in the darkening house. Looking at the small, beautiful creature, Tần Cẩm felt a sudden surge of affection. At least she still had this one companion in the wreckage of her life. She decided to scoop the cat up and take it with her. As she walked toward the restaurant, her path took her past a row of large, rusted trash bins. The sight of them triggered a sudden, unpleasant memory of the day she had encountered Ka Luong. His arrogant, irritating face flashed vividly in her mind. She thought to herself, "I'm dressed beautifully today, carrying a stunning cat in my arms. I look like a refined lady of high society. If I were to run into that man now, it would be the perfect revenge for the last time." At that exact moment, as if summoned by her spiteful thought, the cat in her arms suddenly writhed with supernatural strength and leaped straight into the filth of the trash bin she was passing. Tần Cẩm cried out in alarm, calling for Hackbow, but the cat had already vanished into the depths of the refuse. She let out a frustrated, mournful sigh and began to poke through the trash, desperately hoping to retrieve the stubborn animal before it got covered in grime. While she was bent over, focused on her task, a pair of shoes suddenly appeared in her peripheral vision. They were white, round-toed shoes, and they were tapping out a slow, rhythmic 2-2 beat against the pavement. The very thing she had dreaded most was happening. Tần Cẩm looked up, her face twisted into a grimace that was half smile, half sob. Standing before her was that cursed man, Ka Luong. He looked exactly as he always did, like a man who didn't have a single care in the world, a loner drifting through life. He held a can of Coca-Cola in one hand, his mouth lazily gnawing on the end of a plastic straw. He stared at her with an intense, unblinking gaze before shouting out at the top of his lungs, "Tan little cat!" She immediately lowered her head, pretending she hadn't heard him, her heart sinking into her stomach. He didn't stop. He continued to holler her name across the street. "Tan little cat! Over here!" Pedestrians stopped in their tracks, their curious gazes swinging toward her at the mention of such a strange, ridiculous name. Suddenly, a warm, heavy hand slammed down onto her shoulder. She jumped, her nerves fried, and turned to find Ka Luong standing right behind her. She forced a hollow, pained laugh and said, "What a coincidence! To think I'd see you here again." Ka Luong beamed at her, his face full of a bright, irritating energy. "It seems like destiny is pulling us together. I actually live quite close to this area." She stammered, her voice shaking slightly, "I'm so sorry, but I'm actually in the middle of something very urgent. I have to go now. Let's get in touch later, okay?" As she turned to make her escape, he called out again, his voice dripping with a mock seriousness. "So, how much did you manage to scavenge today?" Good heavens, she thought, this insufferable man still truly believes I am a scavenger, a woman who picks through trash for a living. Was the clothing she had chosen with such care not enough to signal her status? Was there nothing about her that looked noble? She looked down at herself and gasped in horror. The clothes she was wearing were a set of cotton loungewear, now wrinkled, stained, and gray with dust. The night without sleep and the physical toll of her grief had transformed her outfit into a rag. Furthermore, in her haste to find the cat, she hadn't even bothered to brush her hair, which now hung in tangled, wild knots around her face. It was no wonder the loathsome Ka Luong still mistook her for a beggar. It hit her then that this man was her personal jinx, her living curse. Every time she crossed paths with him, disaster followed, and every time, she looked her absolute worst. And there he was, seemingly taking a twisted, vibrant pleasure in observing her downfall. She tried to comfort herself, rationalizing that it wasn't that bad a pair of worn-out shoes paired with an old tracksuit. She just looked like she was heading to a basketball court. She remembered that in his youth, Ka Luong had been obsessed with basketball, though he likely played for some bottom-tier, second-rate team that wasn't even worth watching. Ka Luong stood there, radiating a smug, self-satisfied aura, his face flushing a strange shade of red. He said, "Little cat, it really is wonderful to see you again. Why don't we go grab a drink?" She recoiled, taking several steps back. A deep regret gnawed at her. Why hadn't she ever taken those martial arts classes? Such a skill would be both intellectually stimulating and incredibly useful for situations just like this. Ka Luong took a predatory step forward, raising his hand in a gesture that looked hauntingly like a scene from an old movie where a mischievous rogue torments a helpless flower girl. At that precise second, Hak Bao exploded out of the trash bin like a dark projectile. Ka Luong let out a yelp of pure terror and jerked his hand back. Hak Bao landed on the lid of the trash can, its eyes fixed on the man, watching him with an unnatural, calculating intensity. Seeing the fear radiating from Tan Cam, the cat coiled its muscles and launched itself at the man's chest. Its movement was so fast it was like a black streak of lightning. For a fleeting moment, Tan Cam almost wanted to clap her hands in triumph. However, the confrontation did not end the way she expected. Instead of scratching or biting him to protect her, Hak Bao pressed its face against the man's mouth, kissing his lips with an eerie, intimate familiarity. At first, she had been certain the cat was going to tear his throat out. Instead, it began to gently, rhythmically lick the man's pale face. Ka Luong froze, his body turning as rigid as a corpse, his eyes bulging in a state of absolute, paralyzed shock. The cat's behavior was bizarre, acting as if it had just reunited with a long-lost lover after years of separation, a stark and jarring contrast to the man's sheer, visceral terror. Ka Luong's face was pale, his voice trembling as he shrieked at the top of his lungs. "Cat! Cat! Help me! Get it away from me! Quick, help me get this thing off!" Tan Cam reached down, peeling the creature away and cradling it protectively against her chest. Ka Luong was drenched in a cold, viscous sweat, his body still coiled in a defensive posture as if expecting a lethal strike from the feline. "So," she teased, her eyes narrowing, "it turns out you are actually terrified of cats." Ka Luong forced a brittle, awkward laugh, trying desperately to regain some semblance of his usual nonchalant arrogance. He looked at her with a feigned air of indifference. "Who's afraid of a cat? It's just... I can't stand furry things. I don't like animals with fur, that's all. I just can't bring myself to like them." Tan Cam burst into a fit of mocking laughter. She watched as a single, heavy bead of sweat rolled slowly down his temple, betraying his bravado. She doubled over, clutching the cat, Hak Bao, as she walked away. It felt incredibly satisfying. She had finally managed to get her revenge for his earlier insults. Yet, Hak Bao seemed strangely reluctant to leave, twisting its head back to gaze longingly at the shadow of Ka Luong, who remained frozen in place, paralyzed by the remnants of his fear. Later, sitting in a small eatery, she replayed the ridiculous scene in her mind, a small, dark smile playing on her lips. Suddenly, the sharp, intrusive trill of her phone shattered her amusement. "Hello, Tan Cam. It's Luke Two Min. Hello. I'm sorry, what is it?" "Did something happen?" she asked, the air in the room suddenly feeling several degrees colder. He was silent for a long, heavy moment, his voice sounding hollow and burdened with a grim, brooding sorrow when he finally spoke. "I just came from the hospital. Your friend, On Kai. Something has happened to her again." "Where is she?" Where is she now? Tan Cam's heart began to hammer violently against her ribs. The psychiatric ward, he replied solemnly. The words hit her like a physical blow to the chest. Unable to withstand the shock of this news, Tan Cam collapsed back against her chair, her strength failing her. Do you know why? What happened to her? She won't stop screaming about that dead friend of hers, Lục Tử Minh explained, his voice strained and impatient. Worse than that. She tried to claw her own eyes out. She kept screaming that she had to give them back to Lam Kentucky. We had no choice. We had to restrain her, bind her limbs, and transfer her to the specialized ward for psychiatric treatment. His voice sounded frayed, as if he couldn't endure the memory of it. By the time he had arrived at the scene, the girl named Kai had already descended into a state of total, violent psychosis. She had been using every ounce of her strength to dig her fingernails into her own eye sockets. If the nurses hadn't intervened at that exact second, she would have been blinded forever. Even as they hauled her toward the hospital, her mouth never stopped moving, chanting that one word over and over, gouge. Gouge. Her slender fingers were stained a deep, visceral crimson, drenched in her own blood, yet she continued her frantic attempts to dig into her eyes. But the most bone-chilling sight was the way she was tearing at her own hair, ripping out clumps from the roots as if an invisible hand were trying to peel the skin right off her skull. To see a girl who was once so gentle and refined transformed into such a grotesque, terrifying creature made even a seasoned man like Lục Tử Minh feel a sickening chill crawl up his spine. He had witnessed countless horrors in his career, yet he had never felt a sensation quite like this, a deep, unnatural cold that seemed to freeze the very marrow in his bones. Seeing her covered in blood, her eyes shredded by her own hands, he had felt an overwhelming, primal urge to simply turn and run away. He cursed his own cowardice in the dark of his mind. At that moment, his intuition was screaming at him that this was not merely a tragic series of suicides. Someone was lurking in the shadows, systematically and malevolently destroying Lam Ky and on Kentucky. But there was no evidence. No clues. No trail to follow. He knit his brows in dark thought. When Tan Cam suggested that she go to visit Kai, he refused her immediately. He told her that Kai's mental state was far too volatile and that she shouldn't be disturbed. The truth was, he didn't want Tan Cam to be broken by the sight. If she saw the state Kai was in now, the heartbreak would be even more unbearable than the day she saw Lam Kai's cold corpse. Tan Cam left the eatery, her heart heavy with a suffocating sadness as she trudged down the street, the city lights flickering like dying embers against the night sky. She thought of TT. Would something happen to her too? Lam Ky had died a wretched, horrific death. Kai was now locked away in a madhouse. Tan Cam felt a hollow numbness in her chest. She felt as though she would never be able to smile again. The only comfort she had left was the small cat in her arms. She lowered her head, walking through a particularly desolate stretch of the road. It was pitch black. The streetlights here were broken, casting long, jagged shadows. She thought bitterly that the city management should have fixed them long ago. Suddenly, Hack Bao began to stir in her arms. The cat poked its head out, its golden eyes darting wildly as if tracking something invisible moving in the darkness around them. It struggled, trying with all its might to leap from her grasp. Tan Cam felt it too, a prickling sensation on the back of her neck, a heavy weight in the air. Someone was behind her. She spun around, her heart in her throat, but the street was empty. Just shadows and silence. Her nerves were raw, sensitized by the tragedies of the past few days. She felt a dark, malevolent force hunting her, closing in with every step. Since she was a child, she had always possessed a keen sixth sense, a vague, haunting intuition that warned her when disaster was lurking nearby. Now, she felt danger crouching in every shadow. Was there a predator stalking her on this dark path? Tonight, the road felt alien. Despite it being early evening, not a single soul was in sight. And then, there was the smell, a faint, metallic stench of fresh blood hanging in the stagnant air. Terrified, she began to run toward her house. She couldn't hear the sound of footsteps behind her, but Hak Ba was just as terrified as she was. The cat's fur stood on end, forming a jagged ridge of fear along its spine. She felt a crushing, suffocating pressure closing in on her from all sides. Without warning, her vision began to blur and fail. Everything turned a murky, impenetrable black. She rubbed her eyes, but the more she rubbed, the worse it became. It felt as if some crawling, tiny, sharp-legged things had flown into her eyes, causing an itch so intense it was agonizing. She felt a sudden, violent urge to hurl Hak Ba to the ground so she could use both hands to dig into her eyes, to scratch away the unbearable irritation until she hit bone. But hearing Hak Ba's sharp, panicked cry, she snapped back to her senses. The cat refused to leave her. It pressed its small body against her face, its soft fur acting as a barrier, desperately trying to prevent her from touching her own eyes. The discomfort intensified, becoming a burning, stinging torment. Just as she was about to give in and drop the cat, the oppressive pressure suddenly vanished. The itching stopped. Her eyes cleared instantly. She forced them open, and there, in the dim, ghostly moonlight, she saw those familiar shoes, tapping out that rhythmic, maddening 2/2 beat. For the first time, she didn't find the 2/2 beat guy annoying at all. She looked up at him. He was looking down at her with a look of mock disdain. "Tan the kitten," he said, his voice cutting through the silence, "you really are something else. What is a girl like you doing coming home at this hour? By the way, your cat was actually quite cute earlier. I wasn't scared of it. I just need to make that clear to you, otherwise you'll misunderstand and think I'm some kind of coward. My family line, for 3 generations, have all been famous exorcists and sorcerers." He swayed his body back and forth, repeating his explanation over and over as if to convince himself. Slowly, the cloud of dark sadness over Tan Cam began to dissipate. "Serves you right. That's what you get for calling me a scavenger woman," Tan Cam thought to herself. She decided to ignore him and continued her walk home, but Ka Luong followed her like a shadow, his voice rattling on like a machine gun, talking incessantly. In a fit of annoyance, she suddenly thrust Hak Ba toward him. He recoiled in terror, backing away as he stammered, "I told you, I'm just allergic to cats." "Who's afraid of them?" Hak Ba had calmed down as well, but now it seemed strangely eager to jump onto Ka Luong. It was hard to blame the creature. After all, it was a cat, and to be fair, Ka Luong was quite handsome in his own arrogant way. Ka Luong followed her all the way to her front gate. Tan Cam dashed inside and bolted the door shut behind her. Even through the heavy wood, she could hear Ka Luong's voice shouting from the street, "It's free. My services are free." She leaned against the door, unable to stand the man. A sorcerer? An exorcist? He was nothing but a loudmouthed rogue playing at being a mystic. After finishing her bath and cleansing herself of the day's grime, she climbed into the sanctuary of her bed to seek refuge and sleep. Having labored through a grueling day that left her nerves utterly frayed and physically exhausted, the only essential thing left in her mind was finding some way, any way, to relax her mind and body even just a little bit. Within a mere fleeting moment, her consciousness slipped away, and she tumbled into a heavy, suffocatingly deep sleep. Suddenly, in a state of growing panic, she found herself walking deep into the heart of a dark, primeval forest, where from somewhere unknown, a mysterious and haunting sound began to echo through the gloom. She pushed forward through the thick undergrowth, the fallen leaves beneath her feet letting out a constant, rhythmic rustling like dry whispers. The moonlight above was hazy and pale, casting long, distorted shadows across her path. The mountain trail was treacherous and incredibly difficult to navigate, yet that melodic, haunting sound continued to ring out with a piercing clarity, drawing her further into the darkness. Walking as if possessed by the rhythm of that spectral music, she eventually laid eyes upon a massive, ancient tree standing solitary in the darkness. Under the pale, ethereal glow of the hazy moonlight, the ancient tree looked hauntingly beautiful, and it seemed as though that eerie, rhythmic music was emanating directly from its gnarled, twisted branches. Right at the very moment she intended to step closer to the ancient trunk, a sudden, piercing cacophony of cats screeching and hissing rang out violently right next to her ear. She jolted awake, her heart hammering against her ribs, realizing with a gasp of relief that it had all been nothing more than a vivid, terrifying dream. However, as she turned her head to settle back down, she saw a dark, thick-haired, shaggy creature lying right there against her pillow, and she let out a blood-curdling scream of pure terror. Her piercing cry startled the hairy creature. It shifted its heavy, fur-covered body and stirred, revealing itself to be none other than Hak Bao. Seething with a mixture of lingering fear and sudden anger, she sat bolt upright in bed, casting a sharp, resentful glare at the detestable cat. Hak Bao opened its large, unblinking eyes and stared back at her with such intensity that she no longer had the heart to remain angry, finally resigning herself to let the cat do whatever it desired in the oppressive silence of the night.